October 15th, 1943, 3 miles outside the village of Saint-Vith in eastern Belgium, the morning mist clung to the valley like a grey shroud as the rumble of approaching vehicles echoed through the forest. Marcel Dubois crouched behind a fallen oak tree, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he made final adjustments to what the German army would later describe in their incident reports as an impossibly simple yet devastatingly effective obstacle. The 34-year-old widowed father of two had spent exactly 72 hours preparing for this moment, believing with absolute certainty that his background as a telephone line repairman would prove utterly inadequate against the mechanical might of the German war machine. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Marcel could never have imagined was that his desperate act of defiance would not only halt an entire mechanized convoy in mere seconds, but would also demonstrate how one man's intimate knowledge of physics and timing could achieve what entire military units had failed to accomplish. Marcel had never intended to become part of the resistance movement that operated throughout occupied Belgium during those dark months of 1943. His world had shrunk to the manageable boundaries of caring for 8-year-old Henri and 11-year-old Marie, the two children who represented everything that remained of his life after his wife Colette had perished during the harsh winter of 1942. Working as a civilian contractor, maintaining communication lines for the occupying forces provided just enough food rations to keep his family alive, though Marcel despised every moment he spent ensuring that German communications remained functional across the region. The transformation from reluctant collaborator to active saboteur began on October 12th, when Henri came home from school with tears streaming down his dirt-smudged face, and a story that would change everything. The boy explained how German soldiers had taken his teacher, Monsieur Larsen, away in broad daylight after discovering the elderly educator had been hiding communication equipment for Belgian resistance fighters in the school's basement. Henri described how the soldiers had been particularly rough with the gentle teacher who had helped both children cope with the loss of their mother, shoving the 60-year-old man into a military vehicle while the entire class watched in terror. That evening, as Marcel tucked his children into their shared bed in the cramped back room of their cottage, he made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. Marie, wise beyond her 11 years, looked up at her father with eyes that held far too much understanding of the world's cruelty and whispered, "Papa, will they come for us next?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and Marcel realized that his careful strategy of invisible compliance had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Marcel's expertise with telephone and telegraph systems had given him an intimate understanding of how the German military maintained communication across occupied territories. During his 18 months of forced employment, he had observed that convoys traveling the main supply route through Saint-Vith followed predictable patterns, typically consisting of 4 to 6 vehicles traveling at approximately 30 kilometers per hour through the narrow forest roads that connected major supply depots. The lead vehicle was invariably a reconnaissance car, followed by 2 or 3 supply trucks, with a rearguard vehicle ensuring convoy security. The plan that emerged in Marcel's mind over the next 48 hours combined his knowledge of mechanical systems with an understanding of convoy behavior that he had gained through months of unwilling observation. Every day at precisely 1400 hours, a German convoy would pass through the valley below his cottage, following the same route that had been carved through the forest decades earlier for logging operations. The road featured a particularly narrow section where tall pine trees created a natural corridor with steep embankments on both sides that would make maneuvering virtually impossible for large vehicles. Marcel's trap relied on a principle that any telephone repairman understood instinctively: the incredible tensile strength of properly configured steel cables when subjected to sudden lateral force. Over the course of 3 nights, working by moonlight to avoid detection, he had strung a network of telephone cables between trees on opposite sides of the road, positioning them at precisely the right height to catch the front suspension and axles of moving vehicles. The cables were virtually invisible against the dark forest background, and Marcel had calculated their positioning with mathematical precision based on the standard height measurements of German military vehicles. The genius of Marcel's design lay not in its complexity, but in its elegant simplicity. Rather than attempting to create a single barrier that might be spotted and removed, he had created a progressive series of cable snares positioned exactly 47 meters apart. The first cable would engage the lead vehicle's front suspension, causing immediate deceleration that would force the following vehicles to respond according to standard convoy protocols. The second and third cables would then engage subsequent vehicles before their drivers could react to the initial obstacle, creating a cascading effect that would immobilize the entire convoy within seconds. Marcel had spent countless hours during his legitimate work observing the mechanical specifications of German military vehicles, noting that reconnaissance cars typically featured ground clearance of 28 centimeters, while supply trucks maintained clearance of 32 centimeters. His cables were positioned at exactly 25 centimeters above the road surface, ensuring that they would catch the front axles and suspension components without being visible to drivers focused on the road ahead. The morning of October 15th dawned crisp and clear, with visibility extending nearly 200 meters through the forest. Marcel positioned himself behind the fallen oak tree, approximately 100 meters from his trap, close enough to observe the results but far enough to avoid immediate detection. At 13:55 hours, he heard the familiar rumble of approaching diesel engines, and his heart began racing with a combination of terror and anticipation that made his hands shake uncontrollably. The German convoy appeared exactly on schedule, led by a Horch reconnaissance car, followed by 3 Opel supply trucks and a rear-guard vehicle that Marcel recognized as another reconnaissance unit. Obergefreiter Klaus Richter, the 23-year-old driver of the lead vehicle, was thinking about his upcoming leave time in Frankfurt and barely registering the familiar landscape that flowed past his windscreen. Richter had driven this route 47 times over the past 6 months, and the monotonous duty had dulled his attention to potential threats that might lurk in the seemingly peaceful forest. The first cable engaged Richter's front axle at precisely 1403 minutes past the hour, creating an impact that the young soldier would later describe to military investigators as feeling like driving into an invisible wall. The reconnaissance car's momentum carried it forward another 3 meters before the cable tension brought the vehicle to a complete stop, causing Richter to slam forward against his steering wheel with enough force to bruise his ribs. Behind him, the lead supply truck driver, Gefreiter Hans Müller, had approximately 1.5 seconds to react before his vehicle encountered the second cable. Müller, a 31-year-old veteran from Bavaria, attempted to brake when he saw Richter's vehicle stop suddenly, but the weight of his fully loaded truck made immediate deceleration impossible. The second cable caught Müller's truck with devastating effectiveness, causing the heavy vehicle to lurch violently as its front suspension became entangled in the steel mesh that Marcel had so carefully positioned. The truck's engine stalled immediately, and Müller found himself trapped behind a steering wheel that had become completely unresponsive. The third vehicle in the convoy, driven by Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt from Cologne, encountered Marcel's trap just as Schmidt was reaching for his radio to report the unexpected halt. Schmidt, who had celebrated his 28th birthday just 5 days earlier, managed to apply his brakes with sufficient force to reduce his speed, but the momentum of his loaded supply truck carried him directly into the third cable array. The impact threw Schmidt against his driver's side door, and he watched in amazement as his truck's front wheels became completely immobilized by what appeared to be an impossibly simple arrangement of thin metal cables. Within exactly 9 seconds from initial contact, 3 of the convoy's 5 vehicles had become completely immobilized, creating a traffic obstruction that blocked the narrow forest road in both directions. The fourth vehicle, another supply truck driven by Gefreiter Fritz Zimmermann, managed to stop just short of the cable array, while the rear-guard reconnaissance car maintained sufficient distance to avoid immediate entanglement. From his concealed position, Marcel watched the German soldiers emerge from their vehicles with expressions of confusion and growing alarm. Richter, shaking his head to clear the effects of his collision with the steering wheel, walked around his reconnaissance car 3 times before he could comprehend what had happened to his vehicle. Müller climbed down from his truck cab and spent nearly 2 minutes examining the cable arrangement that had so effectively neutralized his heavy vehicle, muttering words in German that Marcel could not understand, but whose tone of frustration required no translation. Schmidt, the most technically minded of the 3 trapped drivers, recognized immediately that the cable system had been designed with sophisticated understanding of vehicle mechanics and convoy operations. He pointed out to his colleagues that the cables had been positioned at precisely the right height to engage their axles without causing visible obstruction, and that the spacing between cable arrays had been calculated to ensure maximum effectiveness against multiple vehicles traveling in standard convoy formation. The German soldiers' attempts to free their vehicles revealed the true sophistication of Marcel's trap design. The cables had been anchored to trees using a technique that Marcel had learned during his years of telephone line installation, creating anchor points that could withstand tremendous lateral force without yielding. When Richter and Müller attempted to cut the cables using standard military equipment, they discovered that the steel telephone cables required specialized tools that were not included in standard convoy equipment. Zimmermann, whose truck remained mobile, tried to use his vehicle to pull Müller's trapped truck backward, but Marcel had anticipated this possibility. The cable arrangement was designed to tighten under reverse pressure, meaning that any attempt to extract a trapped vehicle would only increase the tension that held it in position. After 40 minutes of increasingly frustrated attempts to clear the obstacle, the German soldiers were forced to acknowledge that professional equipment and additional personnel would be required to restore convoy mobility. The broader implications of Marcel's trap became apparent when the rear-guard vehicle's radio operator, Obergefreiter Andreas Weber, attempted to contact military headquarters in Saint-Vith for assistance. Weber discovered that his radio communications were being interfered with by what appeared to be deliberate signal disruption, though he could not identify the source of the interference. Unknown to Weber, Marcel had spent his final night of preparation installing a small signal jamming device that he had constructed using components salvaged from damaged telephone equipment. The trapped convoy represented a significant operational disruption for German supply operations in the region. The 3 immobilized vehicles contained approximately 4,000 kilograms of military supplies destined for forward positions, including communication equipment, medical supplies, and mechanical spare parts that were critically needed by German units operating along the Belgian-German border. The convoy's delay would force military commanders to reorganize supply schedules and deploy additional resources to clear the obstacle. Word of Marcel's successful sabotage spread rapidly through the local resistance network, carried by farmers and villagers who had witnessed the confused German soldiers standing helplessly beside their trapped vehicles. The story grew with each telling, transforming Marcel from a quiet telephone repairman into a symbol of how individual ingenuity could challenge the mechanized efficiency that German forces relied upon throughout occupied Europe. Marie Fontaine, a 42-year-old baker from Saint-Vith, who supplied bread to German installations, overheard military personnel discussing the incident while making her routine delivery on October 16th. She later reported to resistance contacts that German officers were describing the trap as the work of sophisticated saboteurs with advanced engineering knowledge, apparently unable to believe that a single civilian with basic technical training could have created such an effective obstacle. The German response to Marcel's trap revealed important information about military security procedures that proved valuable to resistance planners throughout the region. Within 6 hours of the initial incident, German forces had deployed engineering equipment and additional personnel to clear the obstacle and restore convoy mobility. However, the resources required for this operation included specialists and equipment that had been diverted from other military priorities, demonstrating how individual acts of sabotage could force occupying forces to allocate scarce resources to defensive rather than offensive operations. Captain Ernst Hoffmann, the 40-year-old German officer responsible for investigating the incident, filed a report that described Marcel's trap as evidence of sophisticated resistance coordination in the region. Hoffmann recommended increased security patrols and enhanced convoy protection measures, not realizing that his response was exactly what resistance leaders had hoped to provoke. By forcing German forces to dedicate additional resources to convoy security, Marcel's single act of sabotage had effectively reduced the efficiency of military operations throughout eastern Belgium. The technical analysis that German engineers conducted on Marcel's cable system revealed the extent of planning and preparation that had gone into creating the trap. Military investigators determined that the cable anchoring system would have required approximately 40 hours of careful installation work, and that the positioning calculations demonstrated intimate knowledge of German convoy procedures and vehicle specifications. The investigation report concluded that such detailed knowledge could only have been acquired through extended observation of military operations, leading to recommendations for enhanced security around supply routes. Marcel's success inspired similar sabotage efforts throughout occupied Belgium during the following months, as resistance fighters realized that simple mechanical obstacles could be far more effective than complex explosive devices that required scarce materials and specialized knowledge. The cable trap technique was adapted and modified by resistance cells in other regions, creating a network of transportation disruptions that forced German military commanders to dedicate increasing resources to supply route protection. The psychological impact of Marcel's trap extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences. German soldiers traveling supply routes throughout the region began experiencing heightened anxiety about potential obstacles, knowing that their vehicles could be immobilized at any moment by virtually invisible traps that required no advance warning and left no opportunity for evasive action. This constant tension affected morale and operational efficiency, forcing convoy commanders to reduce travel speeds and increase spacing between vehicles. For Marcel himself, the success of his trap represented a transformation from passive resistance to active defiance that would define the remainder of his war experience. The knowledge that his simple engineering solution had created significant problems for occupying forces gave him confidence to undertake additional sabotage operations, though he never again attempted anything as ambitious as the convoy trap. His subsequent resistance activities focused on disrupting communication lines and providing intelligence to Allied forces, building on the technical expertise that had made his initial success possible. The long-term historical significance of Marcel's trap lay not in its immediate tactical impact, but in its demonstration that individual civilians with basic technical knowledge could create serious operational challenges for mechanized military forces. The incident became part of resistance folklore throughout occupied Europe, inspiring countless other acts of individual sabotage that collectively created significant disruption for German military operations during the final years of the war. Henri and Marie Dubois would later recall October 15, 1943, as the day their father transformed from a man living in fear to someone who had found the courage to fight back against overwhelming odds. The knowledge that their father had single-handedly stopped an entire German convoy gave both children a sense of pride and hope that sustained them through the difficult months that followed, even as Marcel was forced to maintain his cover as a cooperative civilian contractor. German military records from the period indicate that Marcel's trap was one of approximately 300 similar incidents that occurred throughout occupied Belgium during 1943, suggesting that his individual act of sabotage was part of a broader pattern of civilian resistance that significantly impacted German operational capabilities. The collective effect of such incidents forced military planners to allocate substantial resources to protecting supply lines that had previously required minimal security. The engineering principles that Marcel employed in creating his trap were later studied by Allied intelligence services, who recognized the value of simple mechanical solutions that could be implemented by civilian resistance fighters without requiring specialized equipment or training. The cable trap technique was subsequently included in resistance training materials that were distributed to occupied territories throughout Europe, extending Marcel's innovation to resistance movements in France, Norway, and other occupied regions. The specific details of Marcel's trap design were preserved in German military archives, where they provide insight into both resistance techniques and German security responses during the middle years of the war. The incident reports filed by Captain Hoffmann and other German officers reveal the extent to which individual acts of sabotage could force military organizations to modify their operational procedures and allocate additional resources to defensive measures. Modern historians studying civilian resistance during World War II have identified Marcel's convoy trap as an example of how individual technical knowledge could be transformed into effective resistance action without requiring extensive organizational support or sophisticated equipment. The incident demonstrates that effective sabotage often resulted from intimate understanding of enemy procedures, combined with creative application of available materials and techniques. The psychological transformation that Marcel experienced as a result of his successful sabotage operation reflects a broader pattern of civilian resistance during the war years. Many individuals who initially attempted to avoid confrontation with occupying forces eventually reached a breaking point where passive compliance became impossible, leading to acts of defiance that often surprised the perpetrators themselves with their effectiveness and psychological impact. The story of Marcel's wire trap ultimately represents something larger than a single act of sabotage. It demonstrates how ordinary individuals could find extraordinary courage when protecting what they valued most. His transformation from a fearful father trying to keep his family safe to a man willing to risk everything for the chance to fight back captures the essence of civilian resistance throughout occupied Europe. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.